Let us begin, not in 1135, when a king died, but 7 years later, in the freezing December of 1141, inside a castle under siege at Oxford. Empress Matilda is trapped. Outside the walls, King Stephen's army has surrounded Oxford Castle for months, cutting off food, cutting off hope, tightening a noose of soldiers and siege engines around the woman who believes with every fiber of her being that the crown of England belongs to her by right of blood. Her half-brother and chief general, Robert of Gloucester, is away trying to raise a relief force that may never come in time. The garrison inside the castle is starving. The Thames, the Isis as it was called then, is frozen solid, and the ground beyond it is buried under snow so deep it swallows footprints within minutes. Matilda has a decision to make, and it is the kind of decision that decides not just her own fate, but the fate of a kingdom that has already been tearing itself apart for 6 years. Surrender, and her claim to the throne of England dies with her captivity. Because a captured claimant is a finished claimant, as her rival Stephen himself had already discovered once, humiliatingly, in a muddy field near Lincoln. Or she can attempt something that sounds less like statecraft and more like a folk tale. Walk out of the castle at night, through the enemy lines, across a frozen river, through a blizzard, on foot. She chooses the second option. According to the chroniclers, she and a handful of companions dressed themselves entirely in white. Cloaks, robes, everything. So they blend into the snow. They slip out through a postern gate, or possibly lower themselves down the castle walls on ropes, depending on which account you trust. They walk past Stephen's sentries, invisible against the white ground, and they cross the frozen river on foot in the dark, in December, in a kingdom that no longer has any functioning idea of who is actually in charge of it. They walk roughly 6 miles through the snow to reach the safety of Abingdon, and from there she is taken on horseback the rest of the way to Wallingford Castle, into the arms of her own supporters, alive, uncaptured, and still, in her own mind and in the minds of a great many powerful men across England, the rightful Lady of the English. Stop and sit with that image for a second, because it tells you almost everything you need to know about the era we're about to walk through. This is not a tidy story about 2 royal cousins arguing over a throne in a well-lit hall. This is a story about a woman who was the daughter of a king, the widow of an emperor, and the acknowledged heir sworn to by the entire English nobility. And yet she is reduced at the lowest point of her fortunes, to fleeing across a frozen river in the snow disguised as a ghost, because the alternative is a capture, and capture might mean the end of everything she was promised. How does the kingdom get here? How does the best-laid succession plan of one of medieval Europe's most competent kings collapse so completely that his own daughter is sneaking across ice in the dark just to stay alive, while a different man, a man who swore a personal oath to support her, sits on the throne she was promised? That is the real question sitting underneath everything that follows in this story, and it's worth stating plainly, because it's not really a question about medieval England specifically. It's a question about power itself. When the rules for handing over authority break down, does the throne go to the person with the best claim, or simply to the person who refuses to stop fighting for it? England spent 19 years finding out the hard way. To understand how a kingdom falls apart, you first have to understand how carefully it was built, because the tragedy of the Anarchy isn't that England was ruled by a fool. It's that England was ruled for 35 years beforehand by one of the most capable and calculating monarchs of the entire medieval period. And even he couldn't outmaneuver biology and bad luck. Henry I became King of England in 1100, the 4th son of William the Conqueror, and by any practical measure of medieval kingship, he was a success. He rebuilt and strengthened the royal administration. He developed the Exchequer, the sophisticated financial and record-keeping system that let the crown actually track what it was owed and what it had spent, at a level of bureaucratic competence that was unusual for the period. He kept the peace, more or less, across both England and the family's continental territory in Normandy, using a mixture of calculated marriages, careful patronage, and, when necessary, the threat of overwhelming force. He was not a gentleman. He was, by most accounts, a shrewd, occasionally ruthless operator who understood that a kingdom is not a birthright, so much as a machine that has to be actively maintained, hour by hour, decade by decade, or it seizes up. And for a long time, the machine ran well. Henry had one legitimate son, William Adelin, and the succession looked settled in the way that succession is supposed to look settled. A healthy male heir, groomed and positioned, waiting his turn. Then, on a single night in November 1120, all of that careful engineering was undone in about a minute. The White Ship was a state-of-the-art vessel, freshly outfitted, and it was meant to carry William Adelin and a large group of young Anglo-Norman nobility back across the Channel from Normandy to England, following the main royal party which had already sailed safely ahead. What happened next has become one of the most famous disasters in medieval English history, not because it was militarily significant, but because of how completely, how almost absurdly, it rewrote the future. The ship left port at night. Accounts differ on exactly how it happened. Heavy drinking among the crew and passengers is mentioned in nearly every version, along with a young crew showing off, racing to catch up with the king's ship ahead of them. But the result is not in dispute. The White Ship struck a submerged rock just off the Norman coast and sank almost immediately, in the dark, in cold water, within sight of land. Nearly everyone aboard drowned. William Adelin was among the dead. There's a detail in the traditional account of that night worth pausing on, because it captures the brutal randomness that would come to define this entire era before the era had even properly begun. William Adelin, it said, actually made it into a small rescue boat and might have survived. Then he heard his half-sister screaming for help in the water, turned the boat back to save her, and the boat was swamped by the desperate crowd of other drowning passengers trying to climb aboard, and he went down with everyone else. One report claims a single survivor, a butcher from Rouen who'd stayed aboard to collect a debt and clung to a spar until morning. One man out of nearly 300. Henry I, it said, never smiled again after he received the news. Whether or not that specific detail is literally true, the sentiment behind it captures something real. This wasn't just a personal tragedy for a grieving father. It was a structural catastrophe for an entire kingdom, because it meant the King of England now had no legitimate son, and in a rigidly patriarchal Anglo-Norman aristocracy, where the entire logic of feudal loyalty ran through male lines of inheritance and personal oaths of homage sworn to a lord who could physically lead men into battle, that absence was not a minor administrative inconvenience. It was a live grenade rolling slowly toward the future. Henry did what any capable ruler in his position would try to do. He adapted. He had one other child who had survived infancy, his daughter Matilda. She was not an obvious consolation choice. She had been sent away as a child to marry the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry V, and by the time she was widowed and brought home, she was an experienced, formidable, politically sophisticated woman in her 20s who had spent years as an Empress and had a far better education in the exercise of real power than most male heirs of the period ever received. Henry remarried her, this time to Geoffrey of Anjou, Count of a rival territory whose alliance was strategically valuable, but whose marriage to Matilda was, by most accounts, personally difficult for both parties. And then Henry I did something almost unprecedented for the time. He made his barons swear, not once but repeatedly, in 1127 and again in later years, a formal oath recognizing Matilda as his heir, as the future ruler of England and Normandy. Powerful men across the realm, including, crucially, his nephew Stephen of Blois, knelt and swore personal, binding sacred oaths of loyalty to a woman as their future sovereign. Now, before we move to the next part of the story, you need to know how easy it is to imagine that oath-taking scene and assume it settled the matter. It didn't, not really. And understanding why it didn't is the key to everything that follows. A sworn oath in the 12th century carried enormous religious and social weight. Breaking one was, in theory, a grave sin and a mark of shame. But the idea of a woman actually ruling in her own right, wielding the sword, leading armies, sitting in judgment over male vassals, that idea had almost no precedent and made a great many powerful men deeply uneasy, whatever they'd sworn with their hand on a holy relic. The oath was real. The discomfort underneath it was also real. And when Henry I finally died in December 1135, probably from food poisoning after ignoring his doctor's advice and eating a large meal of lampreys he loved, but which disagreed badly with him, that gap between the sworn word and the unspoken doubt became the single most dangerous fault line in England. Someone was about to discover exactly how wide that gap really was. Here is what makes Stephen of Blois such a genuinely fascinating figure in this story. And it's not a compliment exactly, though it isn't quite an insult either. He understood, better than almost anyone else in England, that in a moment of crisis, the person who moves first and moves fastest often wins, regardless of whose claim is technically stronger on paper. Stephen was Henry I's nephew, the son of Henry's sister Adela, who was herself a daughter of William the Conqueror, which meant Stephen carried genuinely royal blood, was enormously wealthy from his own continental and English holdings, was personally popular with a wide circle of the Anglo-Norman nobility, and had, along with everyone else, sworn that oath to support Matilda's succession. When news reached him that Henry I had died in Normandy, Stephen didn't wait for a funeral, didn't wait for a formal council, didn't wait to see how Matilda's own faction would organize itself. He crossed the English Channel immediately. He went straight to London, where the merchant classes and city leaders, who valued stability, predictable trade, and a male ruler who could physically campaign against threats, were receptive to him. He then moved to secure the support of the church, which mattered enormously, because in an age when royal legitimacy was tangled up inextricably with religious sanction, having the archbishop's blessing was close to having a legal deed to the throne itself. His brother, Henry of Blois, happened to be the powerful Bishop of Winchester, which didn't hurt. Within weeks, Stephen was crowned King of England in December 1135 in Westminster Abbey. The same month his uncle had died. Matilda, meanwhile, was still in Anjou, pregnant, geographically distant from the English political center of gravity, and without the kind of immediate, decisive military and political apparatus needed to contest the throne in real time. It's worth sitting with what this moment actually meant for the people living through it, rather than just narrating it as a sequence of historical events, because the stakes here were not abstract. For Stephen, this was almost certainly a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and he knew it. Kings die, successions open up, and windows like this close within weeks. If he hesitated, if he waited to see how things shook out, someone else might move first, or Matilda's supporters might rally quickly enough to lock the throne down in her name, and Stephen would spend the rest of his life as a wealthy but permanently subordinate nobleman, forever haunted by the throne he could have taken and didn't. For Matilda, still in Anjou, the news of Stephen's coronation must have landed like a physical blow, not just a political setback, but a profound personal betrayal, since Stephen was one of the very men who had knelt and sworn to support her. And for the ordinary barons and knights of England, watching all this unfold, the stakes were different but no less real. Whichever side you backed, and whenever you backed them, could determine whether your family kept its lands, titles, and heads over the next several decades. Loyalty in this world was not sentiment. It was survival calculus, recalculated constantly as the balance of power shifted. A few of the justifications commonly used to explain why so many nobles accepted Stephen's rapid coup, despite the oaths they'd sworn, are worth naming plainly, because they show how thin the ice really was underneath the entire arrangement. Many simply preferred a male ruler for practical military reasons. A king needed to personally lead armies into the field, and doubts about whether a woman could or should do that were widespread and rarely challenged openly. Many resented Henry I's tight, demanding administrative grip and welcomed what they hoped would be a more permissive, more traditionally feudal style of kingship under Stephen. And the church's backing gave waverers a convenient moral cover story. If the archbishop and the bishops were willing to anoint Stephen, then perhaps the oath to Matilda could be quietly reinterpreted, reframed, forgiven. But here's the trap Stephen walked into, and it's the trap that would define the rest of his reign. By breaking his own sworn oath to seize the throne, he had personally demonstrated to every single one of his own vassals that oaths of loyalty in this kingdom were negotiable when the incentives were large enough. He needed those same barons to now swear new oaths to him, and to keep them, this time, unbreakably. He had just taught the entire aristocracy of England, by his own example, precisely how little that kind of promise was actually worth. It would come back to devastate him. For a few years, remarkably, it almost held together. Stephen's early reign, from 1135 into 1138, was relatively stable. Not calm exactly, but functional, the way a cracked dam is still technically holding back the water. Stephen worked to consolidate his position, distributing lands and titles to secure loyalty, campaigning where necessary to put down isolated resistance. But the pressure building behind that crack was enormous, and in 1138, it gave way. Rebellion broke out, first in the Welsh marches, then spreading into parts of northern England, driven by nobles who either genuinely believed in Matilda's claim, saw a strategic opportunity to expand their own power under cover of a righteous cause, or some combination of both, which was, if we're honest, the default emotional state of most medieval baronial politics. The single most consequential of these defectors was Robert, Earl of Gloucester, Matilda's illegitimate half-brother, and a man whose importance to this story is difficult to overstate. Robert was not some minor lord. He held vast estates spanning England and Normandy, commanded real military resources, and possessed the kind of personal credibility and battlefield experience that could actually translate a legal claim into an armed campaign. When Robert formally renounced his allegiance to Stephen and declared for his half-sister, he effectively gave Matilda's cause the one thing it had been missing since 1135, a genuine, capable military spine. What followed was not, and this distinction matters enormously for understanding the period, a clean war of decisive pitched battles between two clearly organized armies. It was something messier, more corrosive, and in many ways more destructive to ordinary life. A low-grade, sprawling, geographically scattered conflict made up of sieges, raids, sudden defections, and, above everything else, castles. Let's slow down here, because this next piece is the actual engine of the Anarchy, the mechanism that turned a succession dispute between two royal cousins into nearly 2 decades of grinding regional suffering across large parts of England. Under a strong king like Henry I, the right to build a castle was tightly controlled by the crown. This wasn't bureaucratic fussiness. It was a core mechanism of royal power. A castle is, at its most basic level, a machine for projecting force over territory. Whoever controls the castles controls the roads, the villages, the harvests, and the people living within reach of its walls. A king who monopolizes castle building monopolizes violence itself, or comes as close to it as medieval technology allowed. The moment royal authority weakened, the moment it became unclear whether Stephen or Matilda actually held ultimate power, and whether either of them could reliably punish disobedience, that monopoly collapsed. Barons across England began throwing up fortifications without royal permission, structures the chroniclers contemptuously dubbed adulterine castles, illegitimate castles born outside the sanctioned bounds of royal authority, much like the era's illegitimate, unauthorized exercise of raw local power itself. These weren't symbolic gestures. Each of these castles functioned as a genuine node of independent authority, a military strong point from which a local lord could dominate the surrounding countryside, a taxation base from which he could extract money, food and labor from villages that had no real alternative but to comply, and a defensive position from which he could resist encroachment by rival lords or by whichever royal army happened to be passing through that season. Multiply that single dynamic across dozens of ambitious barons in dozens of regions simultaneously, and what you get is not really a two-sided civil war at all. It's a fractured landscape of small, semi-independent military statelets, each run by a local strongman whose actual loyalty to Stephen or Matilda was often secondary to his own territorial ambition. The human cost of this fragmentation, described by contemporary chroniclers like Orderic Vitalis, was severe, even if modern historians rightly caution that the intensity of suffering probably varied enormously from region to region rather than being uniform across the whole kingdom. Local populations trapped near these garrisons endured extortion, forced labor, and violence, with no functioning higher authority to appeal to for protection or justice. If your local lord's men demanded your grain, your labor, or your daughter, there was no sheriff to complain to, no royal court that could reliably intervene, no guarantee that the political winds wouldn't shift again next season and hand control of your village to an entirely different, equally hungry garrison. This, more than any single battle, is what the word anarchy is really describing. Not the total absence of all law everywhere. Many regions, in fact, maintained relatively functional local administration throughout the period, and the church continued operating as a genuine stabilizing institution even in the worst years. But in the areas where the fighting was heaviest, order didn't just weaken. It fractured into dozens of competing micro-orders, each one legitimate only within arm's reach of its own castle walls, and utterly meaningless the moment you crossed into the next lord's territory. And it's against this backdrop of scattered, decentralized, castle-by-castle warfare that the one genuinely decisive set-piece battle of the entire conflict took place. The moment where, for one brief and dazzling instant, it looked like the whole war might actually be over. By early 1141, the fighting had drawn both sides toward the city of Lincoln, where a local political dispute over control of Lincoln Castle escalated into a full royal siege, with Stephen personally leading his forces to besiege the castle, currently held against him by allies of Robert of Gloucester's faction. Robert of Gloucester and Matilda's other supporters marched to relieve the siege, and on the 2nd of February, 1141, Candlemas, the two sides met outside the walls of Lincoln in one of the only genuinely large pitched battles of the entire war. It did not go well for Stephen. His forces were broken. Several of his key allies fled the field early, which is its own quiet commentary on exactly how thin the loyalty underpinning his kingship really was by this point. Men who had sworn to fight for him took one look at how the battle was turning and decided their own survival mattered more than his crown. Stephen himself, to his genuine credit as a physically brave man, whatever his other political failings, did not flee. He stood and fought, reportedly wielding first a sword and then, after it broke, a borrowed battle axe, continuing to fight even as the men around him fell or fled, until he was finally overwhelmed and taken prisoner. Think for a moment about what that single moment of capture actually meant, in real, practical terms, for everyone involved. For Stephen, it was catastrophic almost beyond calculation. A crowned, anointed King of England taken in chains, his personal safety now entirely dependent on the mercy of his enemies, his kingship suddenly existing only in name while his rival's faction controlled the actual living body of the king. For Matilda and Robert of Gloucester, it was the single greatest opportunity either of them would ever have. The man who had stolen the throne out from under her, physically removed from the board, with nothing standing between Matilda and the crown except the logistics of actually claiming it. Matilda moved to seize that opportunity. She had herself proclaimed Lady of the English, a careful, deliberately calibrated title, notably short of Queen, suggesting either strategic caution or a recognition of how contested even this moment of apparent triumph really remained. She traveled to London, on the verge of what would have been a full and formal coronation, the final step that would have ended the war in her favor and rewritten the next several centuries of English royal succession. And then, in one of history's most instructive lessons in how battlefield victory and political victory are not remotely the same thing, she blew it. The details vary somewhat by source, but the general shape of the failure is consistent. Matilda, now effectively in control of London, needed the cooperation and financial support of the city's powerful merchant and citizen class to actually govern and to fund her new regime. Instead, by most accounts, she demanded heavy taxation, refused to negotiate flexibly with London's civic leaders, and generally conducted herself with a rigid, imperious administrative style that alienated exactly the people whose cooperation she most urgently needed. London rose against her. She was driven out of the city in 1141, her coronation collapsing before it could ever formally take place, her moment of maximum leverage slipping away within weeks of the greatest military victory her side would ever achieve. Sit with the whiplash of that for a second, because it's genuinely one of the most human moments in this entire saga. She had done the impossible, captured the king, broken his army, positioned herself one ceremony away from the throne her father had spent years trying to secure for her. And she lost it all, not on a battlefield, but in a council chamber, through what reads across the surviving accounts as a failure of political persuasion rather than military strength. Winning a war and winning the peace that follows it, it turns out, require almost entirely different skills, and having one does not guarantee the other. The war was not over. It had barely even changed direction. This story tends to run into disasters, and the next one is no exception. Later in 1141, Matilda's forces suffered a sharp reversal of their own at what's known as the Rout of Winchester, where Stephen's supporters, led in part by his formidable and politically sharp wife, Matilda of Boulogne, who deserves far more credit in most tellings of this period than she typically receives, struck back hard enough to capture Robert of Gloucester himself. This mattered enormously, arguably as much as Stephen's own capture had mattered months earlier, because Robert wasn't just a general. He was the actual load-bearing structure of Matilda's entire military effort. Her resources, her credibility, her connective tissue between scattered allies. Without him, her cause risked collapsing outright. And so the two sides did something that, from a distance, looks almost darkly comic in its symmetry. They traded their prisoners. Stephen, captured at Lincoln, was exchanged for Robert, captured at Winchester, and the war reset almost exactly to where it had started. Except now everyone involved had personally witnessed, up close, just how fast and how completely the entire balance of the conflict could flip on a single afternoon's fighting. Neither side had achieved anything close to a decisive, lasting advantage. Both had simply proven, at enormous cost, that the other side could not easily be destroyed either. What followed through the mid-1140s was less a war of great turning points and more a war of attrition and exhaustion. Territory shifting hands repeatedly without permanent resolution. Regional lords growing increasingly powerful and increasingly autonomous as both national factions became consumed by the immediate demands of survival rather than long-term conquest. This is the period where England, as a coherent political unit, came closest to genuinely dissolving into a patchwork of semi-independent baronial territories. Places like the Earldom of Chester or the Bishopric of Durham functioning in practice almost as their own small sovereign states, paying lip service to whichever national claimant happened to be locally convenient while actually running their own affairs. It's a strange, uncomfortable stretch of the story to narrate, because it lacks the dramatic clarity of a single battle or a single dramatic escape across a frozen river. It is, instead, simply years of famine described by chroniclers, years of displaced populations, years of a kingdom slowly forgetting what it felt like to have one reliable, functioning center of authority. And it's precisely because this stretch is so exhausting to read about that it's worth remembering how exhausting it must have been to actually live through. An entire generation of English children born, raised, and approaching adulthood, having never known a kingdom that wasn't quietly, chronically, unpredictably at war with itself. But while England ground itself down in this stalemate, something quietly decisive was happening across the Channel in Normandy. And it belonged to neither Stephen nor Matilda. Here's a point worth pausing on, because it changes the whole shape of the story from this point forward. The person who ultimately ended the anarchy was not Stephen and was not Matilda. It was their son. While the fighting in England dragged on in its grinding, inconclusive fashion, Matilda's husband, Geoffrey of Anjou, had been steadily, methodically campaigning across the Channel in Normandy, gradually bringing the duchy under his own control. A quieter, less dramatic conquest than anything happening in England, but one that mattered enormously, because it meant that by the time Matilda and Geoffrey's son, Henry Plantagenet, came of age, he inherited not just a contested claim to England, but an actual, functioning, secured territorial base in Normandy from which to launch it. Henry was, by all accounts, a genuinely different kind of political animal than either of his parents. Where his mother's claim carried the baggage of 2 decades of failed campaigns, personal grudges, and the political scar tissue of her aborted 1141 coronation, Henry represented something cleaner. A fresh claim, a new generation, a plausible future rather than a relitigated past. By the late 1140s, still a young man, he began actively campaigning in England himself, and something important shifted in how the war was understood by the people fighting it. This was no longer simply a fight between Stephen and Matilda's competing personal legitimacies. It was becoming a fight over which family's future would ultimately inherit England. And Henry, unburdened by the specific failures and grudges that had accumulated around his mother and Stephen over 15 years of war, was uniquely positioned to be the person both exhausted sides could eventually accept. This is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it's a pattern that shows up again and again throughout history whenever a conflict runs long enough. The two original combatants can become so personally and politically entangled in their mutual grievances that neither can ever fully back down without an unbearable loss of face, even long after both sides genuinely want the fighting to stop. What such conflicts often need, if they're going to end without one side being utterly annihilated, is a third path. Someone connected to the dispute, but not fully captured by its accumulated bitterness. Henry was that path. By the start of the 1150s, both factions were, in every sense that mattered, running on fumes. Stephen's authority, weakened by years of inconclusive fighting and the ongoing autonomy of powerful regional lords who no longer took his commands especially seriously, had never fully recovered from the psychological blow of his capture at Lincoln, even after his release. Matilda, for her part, had increasingly withdrawn from the day-to-day fighting in England, focusing her remaining energy on Normandy and on securing her son's future claim rather than continuing to personally chase her own crown. And the English nobility, the barons, the bishops, the earls who'd spent nearly 2 decades watching their lands, loyalties, and lives get tossed around by a conflict with no end in sight, had by this point largely had enough. In 1153, Henry Plantagenet returned to England once more, this time with real military strength behind him and, more importantly, with the wind of exhausted public and baronial opinion at his back. What's genuinely striking about this final phase of the conflict is how it ends. not with the decisive climactic battle that nearly 2 decades of build-up might lead you to expect, but with something far more pragmatic and, in its own way, far more historically significant: a negotiated settlement. Rather than pushing for outright military conquest, Henry applied sustained diplomatic pressure, and the result was the Treaty of Wallingford in 1153. An agreement that reads, on its surface, almost like a face-saving compromise between two sides too tired to keep fighting and too proud to admit outright defeat, but which in substance quietly resolved the single question that had torn England apart for 18 years. The terms were elegantly simple. Stephen would remain king for the rest of his natural life, preserving his personal dignity and the legitimacy of his reign as it had actually been lived, while formally recognizing Henry, not any of Stephen's own sons, as his successor. It's worth naming plainly just how unusual and, in a way, quietly wise this solution actually was. It let an old, exhausted king finish his life still wearing his crown, sparing him the specific humiliation of being deposed by the young rival who'd spent years fighting him. And it gave Henry, and by extension Matilda, the one thing they'd actually wanted all along underneath all the fighting. Not necessarily the crown in Stephen's own lifetime, but the certainty that the crown would belong to their bloodline afterward. Both sides got to walk away from the negotiating table, having achieved, in some real, if imperfect sense, what they'd started fighting for in the first place. Stephen died the following year, in 1154, only a year after signing the treaty that had finally, quietly, ended the war that had defined nearly his entire reign. And Henry Plantagenet ascended the throne as King Henry II, the first monarch of what would become one of the most consequential dynasties in the entire history of the English crown. Here's where the story needs one final, important turn, because it would be easy to end on the Treaty of Wallingford and treat the whole affair as simply a costly, nearly 2-decade-long detour that finally corrected itself. That undersells what actually happened. The Anarchy didn't just end, it left permanent marks on how England would be governed for centuries afterward, and understanding those marks is really the payoff for having sat through the whole grinding, exhausting story. Henry II, taking the throne as a young man who had grown up literally shaped by the chaos of his parents' failed war, moved almost immediately and with striking focus to prevent anything like it from ever happening again. He worked aggressively to dismantle the illegal adulterine castles that had sprung up across the countryside during the fighting, physically tearing down the infrastructure of decentralized baronial power that had made the Anarchy possible in the first place. He centralized and expanded royal legal authority, strengthening the reach and consistency of royal courts in a way that historians widely credit as a foundational step toward the later development of English common law itself. A direct institutional reaction to nearly 20 years of watching what happens to a kingdom when royal justice simply stops functioning in large parts of the countryside. More broadly, the Anarchy became a kind of permanent cautionary tale, embedded in the political memory of subsequent English monarchs, about the specific dangers of unchecked baronial autonomy and uncontrolled private castle building, lessons that shaped royal policy toward the nobility for generations afterward. And the succession crisis itself, the entire chain of events triggered by one drowned heir in 1120, exposed with brutal clarity just how fragile a medieval kingdom's stability really was whenever the rules of inheritance were ambiguous, contested, or simply untested by real-world crisis. A vulnerability that later monarchs and their advisors would spend considerable effort trying to legally close off. There's also a genuinely important historiographical question worth raising honestly before closing this story out, because modern historians don't actually agree that anarchy is even the right word for what happened, and their hesitation is worth taking seriously rather than dismissing as pedantry. Governance, as we've already seen, didn't collapse everywhere uniformly. Plenty of regions maintained functioning local administration throughout the period, and the church notably continued to operate as a genuinely stabilizing institution even during the worst years of the fighting. What actually happened wasn't the complete absence of order so much as its fragmentation, a breakdown of one single, centralized authority into a shifting, unstable patchwork of smaller, localized authorities, each legitimate only within its own limited reach, none of them permanently secure. That distinction actually matters, and it brings us back, finally, to the central question this whole story has been circling since Matilda first stepped out into the snow at Oxford. When the rules for transferring power break down, when there's no unambiguous, universally accepted answer to who's actually in charge, authority doesn't simply vanish. It doesn't stay put with whoever had the technically strongest legal claim either. It fragments and flows, unpredictably, toward whoever can hold it, castle by castle, county by county, year by grinding year, until either one side achieves an outright, decisive victory, or, as actually happened here, both sides simply exhaust themselves into a negotiated peace that gives the future to a third person neither of them fully anticipated when the fighting began. Matilda never wore the crown of England, but her son did, and his son did after him, and the Plantagenet dynasty that emerged out of the wreckage of her failed claim went on to rule England for over 300 years. In the strange arithmetic of medieval succession, she lost the war and won almost everything that actually mattered. Stand back now from all of it. The drowned prince, the broken oath, the illegal castles, the captured king, the woman in white crossing the ice. And what you're left with isn't really a story about a specific succession dispute in 12th century England at all. It's a story about the gap between legitimacy and power, and about how long, how bloody, and how strange the road can be when a society is forced to close that gap by force rather than by law. England eventually found its way back to a single, stable throne. It took 19 years, one drowned heir, one broken oath, one captured king, one failed coronation, and one long, cold walk across a frozen river to get there. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, be sure to like the video, share it with fellow history enthusiasts, and subscribe for more deep dives into the people, civilizations, battles, myths, and moments that shaped our world. Leave your thoughts and theories in the comments below. Your perspective might inspire a future video. Until next time, keep exploring history because the past is never truly gone.